Freilichen Purim. A beautiful and happy Purim should descend on you if it's not already Purim. Here in Los Angeles, it's 4:45, so Purim begins about an hour. I've been fasting all day. This is a minor fast, the fast of Esther. We commemorate, like in the book of Esther, that Esther fasted because the Jews around the world, all the Jews in the world, were in grave danger, right? As we read in the book of Esther, also known as the Megillah, right? And we're going to be reading this here live on Accidental Talmudist tomorrow at noon Pacific. I'll be reading it in English. That does not fulfill a Jew's obligation to hear the Megillah read on Purim. It should be done live and in Hebrew. That is halakhically what should happen. However, this year, people under quarantine, we shared an article earlier today, there are provisions being made, even in the most Orthodox circles, but you should look up what the ruling is before you rely on it. But it is a tradition here at Accidental Talmudist, not in order to fulfill people's obligation, but for the purpose of learning, that I'll be reading the book of Esther at noon Pacific with great vim and vigor, with enthusiasm, and perhaps a little bit of commentary along the way. We'll also have the donate button on. All donations tomorrow during the Megillah reading will pass through us, and 100% of the donations will be delivered to the poor, enabling people to that will fulfill the obligation of giving charity to the poor. A Jew should give charity to the poor on Purim, particularly people who are hungry, send gifts to each other, and hear the Megillah reading. Those are some of the laws of Purim. Okay. We are in the second tractate of the Talmud, Shabbos. We're in chapter 1, Yetzias, which is all about removing an object from one domain and placing it in another. This is a biblically forbidden labor on Shabbat. And we're inspecting special cases in order to understand exactly what this law means and how it operates. Yesterday, we started to discuss the strange case of a person whose arm is extended out of his house, shall we say, from the private domain into a public domain. And the question comes up, can he pull his hand back in? Now, there's only certain circumstances where this is a problem. First of all, it has to involve Shabbat. If it's any other day of the week, of course he could stick his hand out of a window or door of his house and pull it back in. It's only under very particular conditions, and it's a little bit hard to understand that question. So here on page 4, we're going to inspect a related question that's going to make it a little bit easier for us to understand it. Now, this question was posed by... what is the sage's name? So Rav Bevai bar Abaye. Rav Bevai bar Abaye. So in order to help us understand whether the guy with his arm sticking out of his house can pull his arm back in, let's look at the case of somebody who baked bread on Shabbat and the special circumstances of this. So first, in order to understand the question, let's understand what an oven was in ancient times, right? In ancient times, they didn't have a General Electric, stove range. What do you call that? A range top with a stove, oven stove. Oh my God, a stove oven. I can't believe I don't know what it's called. But these days we have with the burners on top, the oven below. I forget what the technical name is for that right now. Basically, we call it an oven. But in the ancient times, an oven was a large clay structure, similar to a chimenea, right? These days, you may have seen these in Mediterranean climates, where it's a large object made out of clay. There's an opening in front. You burn a fire inside. Smoke goes out the top. But back then, it was a clay oven, okay? And if you were going to make bread, also a little bit like a pizza oven, right? You'd put this dough inside this large clay oven that also has a fire burning inside, or coals, let's say. But what you would do is you would take your dough and you would stick it to the side of the clay oven. It would bake literally on the clay surface of the oven. You could stick a whole bunch of breads in there, a whole bunch of masses of dough around the sides of the clay oven. And when the bread was baked, you could reach inside with a special tool. I don't think they had oven mitts, right? So it was some kind of a special tool that they would use to pry the dough off the clay wall of the oven. So you cannot bake on Shabbos, right? Now here's the key. If you unwittingly bake on Shabbat, if you didn't know it was Shabbat, so you thought it was just any day, you lost track of the calendar, and then you put some dough in the oven, you baked it, you removed it, and you're about to eat it, and then you're like, oh, it's Shabbos, I shouldn't have done that. So that was a complete action. You baked the bread, right? You inserted the dough, it baked, and you removed it. Insert, bake, and remove. That's a complete action. You did it unwittingly, but it is punishable by a sin offering. So that's the case where you are liable to a chatas, liable to a sin offering. Now, what happens if you know it's Shabbat, right? If you know it's Shabbat and you're a Jew and you say, nah, I don't care. I'm really hungry, so I'm gonna bake it anyway, right? Now, the actual punishment for that, for intentionally violating Shabbat, is stoning, right? So if you were in a community that like were the children of Israel in the desert, and somebody warned you that if you did this, and then you did it, right? So two people witnessed it, and you were warned, and you're submitting to this authority, right? You didn't run away from the Jews and go live somewhere else. You're not rejecting being a Jew. You're a Jew living among Jews in a completely Jewish community like the children of Israel in the wilderness, having come out of Israel, and you intentionally violated Shabbat. So the punishment for that is stoning, right? You would literally be stoned, and it's not, by the way, like the image that you might have in your mind that the death penalty by stoning is they stand you up against a wall and people throw rocks at you. Stoning actually means you get thrown off a cliff. That's for another day. So if you do it intentionally, okay, that the punishment for that is stoning. So let's say it's unwitting. You forgot that it's Shabbos, and now the dough is in the oven, and now you remember it's Shabbos. What do you do? So this is the real question, right? You didn't mean to violate Shabbos. You didn't realize it was Shabbos. Either you didn't know that you can't bake on Shabbos, or you didn't know it was Shabbos. But either way, you stuck the dough in the clay oven, and then you remembered that it's Shabbos, or you remembered that you cannot bake on Shabbos. What do you do, right? Now you have this problem. And what do the sages want you to do? So that's what we're discussing, right? So he actually has an opportunity to ask a rabbi, what should I do? And what should the rabbi tell him, right? So that's the situation. Now, if he leaves the dough in the oven, it will bake, right? And if it bakes, then presumably now he's liable. He didn't do it intentionally, so the punishment is not stoning, but it's presumably the punishment is that he's liable to bring a sin offering in the temple, right? When the temple stood, for unwitting violation, unintentional violation of Shabbat, the punishment is you have to bring a sin offering, a particular offering that's going to be offered on the altar. That's if you let it continue to bake. So maybe the answer is remove it. That would seem to be the obvious answer. So just remove the dough from the oven. The problem is that removing bread from an oven, because it's a special skill, right? The dough is placed on the wall of the oven. It's not simple. You need a tool to do it. That action in itself is prohibited rabbinically, right? So the baking on Shabbat, that is prohibited doraisa, biblically. It's a Torah prohibition. And removing dough from an oven on Shabbat is prohibited derabanan, right? Prohibited by the rabbis. Why did they create this prohibition? So that people won't come to bake on Shabbat. Like if you know that you're not allowed to remove the dough from the oven, you won't, for example, start the baking before Shabbat started with the intention of pulling it out during Shabbat. You should have completed your baking before Shabbat, right? That's the problem. But now you're in this situation and you're wondering what to do. So one approach is, well, violate the rabbinic prohibition so that you don't come to violate the biblical prohibition, right? It would seem that the biblical prohibition is more important, and so we'd rather violate the rabbinic prohibition, we'd rather tell him to violate the rabbinic prohibition than to violate the biblical prohibition. Not so simple. Turns out that there's another little wrinkle in our analysis. Why is he asking this question, right? If he simply didn't realize it was Shabbat, put the dough in the oven, it baked, and he removed it, and only then did he realize that it's Shabbat, okay, so he violated the biblical prohibition and the act is done. But if he's asking the question, can I take it out of the oven, so he realized before it baked, right? Because of that, the complete action cannot have been done unwittingly, right? Halfway through, he became aware that he's violating the biblical prohibition, and it is not a complete action, insert, bake, remove, done unwittingly. And because the complete action is not done unwittingly, it began unwitting, and then he became aware of what the problem was, he actually is exempt from the sin offering. It's a different analysis. Because he's exempt from the sin offering, even though he did violate Shabbos, but he's exempt from the sin offering, so we don't want him to violate yet another prohibition by removing and taking that action, so he should just let it sit, right? It'll burn, whatever, as long as it's not going to endanger the house, the bread will be ruined, but he leaves it there. He doesn't violate the additional prohibition, even though it's a rabbinic prohibition, of taking the dough out of the oven. Let me consult my notes here. So we say, but, different question, if he knew it was Shabbat, he said, you know what, I don't care, I'm going to bake it anyway because I'm hungry. So he stuck the dough in the oven, and then he regretted it. The first case is, he didn't realize it was Shabbat, and then he realized, right? So he went from unwitting to aware. There we say, leave it in the oven, don't violate another prohibition. In the second case, he stuck it in intentionally, he meant to violate Shabbos, and then he regretted it. He said, you know what, I don't want to be a sinner, I don't want to be so blatant and arrogant as to, knowing that I'm violating Shabbos, just violate it. So he regrets. Now, if he leaves it in there, it's intentional, right? It's intentional that it's going to bake. It was intentional that he put it in, and now it would be intentional that it keeps baking. In that case, we allow him to remove the dough from the oven, to violate the rabbinic prohibition, so that he will avoid violating a prohibition whose penalty is stoning, right? That's like the highest level of sin and problem and violation. And so there we will let him violate the lesser prohibition, the rabbinic prohibition on removing, so that he doesn't come to violate a prohibition whose punishment is stoning. And that makes sense. If he's going to remove it, however, we encourage him to remove it not in the usual way. Not to do like whatever the gesture, the manipulation that you do with your tool to normally remove the dough. It's almost like you do it in an unusual way with your left hand, kind of reaching out, signaling to yourself that you know this is not the right way to do it. You're not doing it in the normal way. You're not doing the normal weekday activity of baking and then removing from the oven, and doing it in the unusual way, sort of lessens the offense a little bit. And we'll do that, for example, these laws we'll study later in our journey through Tractate Shabbos. A hammer is a tool that only gets used for activities that would violate Shabbat, right? Like you can't do creative labor on Shabbat. What's a hammer for? A hammer's for creative labor. So that's a muktzeh item. It's something you don't even touch on Shabbat, right? But if you need the place where the hammer is, that somebody left the hammer on the dining table, and now you want to put the plates on the table and eat there, so even though you normally wouldn't want to touch that hammer all through Shabbat, now you need the place that the hammer is on, so you're allowed to move the hammer, but you wouldn't pick it up the way you normally would hold a hammer. You try to pick it up like a little bit unusual to signal to yourself and others around that you know this is a muktzeh item. It's an item that shouldn't be touched on Shabbat, and you're just moving it. You're not going to accidentally come to use it as a hammer. Okay. Okay. All right, so we've discussed those two cases of the dough in the oven. If we did it intentionally, right, that's such a heavy penalty that we allow him to remove. If it was unwitting that he put it in there, so then we say he should let it sit and not violate the rabbinic prohibition on removing. This brings us back to the guy whose arm is sticking out of the house, right? So let's say he, it would be, so there's different cases. Maybe it was before Shabbat began, so he did a legal thing. He stuck his arm out there and then he fell asleep, right? So he's in his house, his arm is sticking outside the house. Whoops. His arm is sticking outside the house, and the question is, can he bring his hand and the object that's in it back into the house? Well, first of all, if he's less than 10 hand breadths above the ground, so then he's in the airspace of the ground, it's considered like being on the ground. So then that object that's in his hand is out there, and it's in the public domain, and if he then brings it inside the house, he transferred that object from the public domain to the private domain, and that would be a violation of Shabbos. So we tell him, no, leave your arm out there. Leave your hand out there. You can't bring your hand back in, right? Well, could he just drop the object? Yes, he could. But what if the situation is that it was during Shabbat that he stuck his hand outside, right? Now the object began inside, and now it's outside, right? So if he then puts the object down outside, then he made that transfer from inside to outside, and we don't want him to do that. So we'd certainly want him to just retract and pull his hand back. But it's unclear whether that object is already out there if it's lower than 10 hand breadths. If it's above 10 hand breadths, then it's just out in the air, right? He took something from inside, he stuck it out there. It never came to rest outside. Okay, so he should just pull it back in. That would be the simple answer there. What if he intentionally stuck his hand out there, something he shouldn't have done because it's risky? Do we want to punish him and tell him that he cannot retract his hand back inside? I mean, this thing with the arm, it seems like so simple. It's just, okay, a guy's got a thing in his hand, he sticks his hand outside the window, can he pull his hand back in? And yet there's just tremendous complexity, and there's a lot of different cases. And one thing that we have to understand is the hand itself becomes a kind of domain, which is neither inside nor outside. And we know that because of the original case in the Mishnah, right? That the poor man was outside. He took an object from the outside. He sticks his hand inside the house, right? If the homeowner takes that object out of the man's hand, then the two of them combined to do a forbidden activity. If, on the other hand, the poor man sticks his hand inside the house and places that object in the hand of the homeowner, then the guy outside, he's liable to the sin offering. The guy inside didn't do anything. But what we see from that is that the hand, even though it's attached to a person who's outside, right, doesn't have the same status as being outside. Because if the rich man takes from the poor man's hand, if the homeowner takes from the poor man's hand, takes the object that the poor man stuck into the house, and the homeowner takes it from his hand, it's not the same as just picking something up that's on a table in his house and moving it over to another table in his house, right? You can move things around in your house and there's no violation. That hand is sticking inside his house. So if he takes it, right, why is anything happening at all? Why is he even related to a problem? It must be that hand, has some kind of odd status because it's not the same. It doesn't have the same status. It doesn't have the same status as just being outside, right? In some sense, it does. If the rich man, he went out, took something from the poor man while it was out there and brought it in, then he would be liable. If he takes from the poor man who's inside from his hand, so then it's different. Then a different thing has happened, right? They combine rather than the rich man being liable entirely to the sin offering himself. The upshot of all this is that the hand becomes its own domain for the purposes of this analysis. And a hand is unusual because it doesn't have a place the way a person does. A person stands in a place. A hand moves around. We don't know where the hand is. So in each of these cases, we have to think carefully about what is the status of the hand and what is it connected to. And here on page 4, we compare a little bit to a tree. A tree could be, let's say, in a private domain. It's rooted in the private domain, and yet its branches extend over a fence out into the public domain. And if you throw an object onto a branch in the public domain, what have you done something? Have you transferred? The root of the tree, the trunk of the tree is in the private domain. The branches are outside. What have you done, right? I'm not going to explain all these rules because there's so many in so many different cases and so many variables. But this is to introduce you to the idea that each case has to be examined carefully. And the case that's a little bit easier to understand, thanks to Rav Bevai Bar Abaye, is this dough in the oven, right? So just to review, if a guy intentionally sticks dough in the oven on Shabbat, knowing that it's Shabbat, and then regrets doing that, so then we allow him to violate the rabbinic prohibition of removing dough from the oven so that he doesn't come to violate the violation of Shabbos punishable by stoning, which is the case when he intentionally violated Shabbat by baking on Shabbat. But if it was unwitting, he didn't know it was Shabbat when he put it in the oven, then we tell him not to violate the rabbinic prohibition because he's not going to be liable to the sin offering because it was unwitting and then he became aware. So I think if we look at this, if we look at this from a traditional Jewish point of view, what are the sages telling us, right? What is our takeaway here? First of all, of course, you want to be careful. These rules are not easy, right? They open the discussion of Shabbat with one of the most complicated laws that there could possibly be. Not with the simple idea of you will rest on Shabbat. You will sanctify Shabbat. You will make a kiddush at the beginning of Shabbat. We might have expected that our discussion of the laws of Shabbat would open with, lighting candles right before Shabbat begins and making a kiddush over wine after Shabbat begins in order to sanctify the day. But instead, our sages jump right into these really complicated laws that, even for people who've been studying this a long time, they're difficult to understand. Who can keep track of all these cases? And I think the message that they're sending is, well, what chance do you have if you don't study? You're going to violate something unless you make it your business to know as much as you can about these laws. So I think their first takeaway to Jews is don't be scared, don't panic, right? But learn. You need to learn in order to, or you will come to violate these laws. So it's something that you always need to be growing. In our journey, now we're Orthodox Jews. For a long time, we were studying and learning and trying to do more and more and becoming more and more Sabbath observant, and we weren't all the way there to Orthodox. We were growing very slowly, right? And our dear friend Schwartzy used to say, look, everybody's at a different place on the ladder. Even in the Orthodox world, there's a tremendous diversity. Some people much more observant than others. It doesn't matter so much where you are on the ladder, but what direction you're moving in. And I think that applies to everybody, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. Anybody who's going to take a life of faith seriously is going to come to understand that, okay, this is a big field, right? Religion is a big field. Faith is a big field. The Bible is just so tremendous. And in order to live a righteous life, it's going to take study, right? It's going to take growth. It's going to take constant learning. And it doesn't matter where you start or where you are now, as long as you have this mindset of growing and learning. Why? Because you love God, because you fear God, because you want to do the right thing. And we're humble about it and say, okay, you know, this is not easy. I need to keep learning. I need to keep learning. All right. I'll just check the comments to see if there's any questions. I don't see any questions over here. I don't see any questions over there. I don't think so. Live chat. Yeah, okay. All right, my friends. Purim is coming. I'm really excited to end my fast. I'm going to be going to the afternoon prayers. Then it's a special sequence. Usually at the end of the afternoon, right before sunset, I would go to Mincha, the afternoon prayers, and then right away we'd do Ma'ariv, the evening prayers, as the sun went down in between afternoon and evening prayers. Today, we'll do Mincha, then I'll come home to have a little break, then go back to synagogue, and we'll have the Megillah reading and the evening service. Somebody asks, are you vegan? Rachel Hughes says, are you vegan? I am not vegan, but I do find that the more vegetables I eat and the more plant-based food I eat, the better I feel. Interestingly for me, I do very well when I eat red meat. I don't have a problem with it. It's good for me. I mean, I can't eat ridiculous quantities of it, and I certainly don't eat it every day. Some people only eat red meat, meat only on Shabbos. Meat only on Shabbos. Mosi. There's an acronym for that, for people who eat meat only on Shabbos. We'll eat meat on Shabbos and maybe 1 or 2 days elsewhere in the week. Often not. But chicken, which is, so Jewish to eat lots of chicken and chicken soup, my body doesn't, I'll eat chicken, but I don't do so well with it. My body is much happier eating red meat. But my body is happiest, and I think most people, like the more vegetables you eat, the more plant-based food I eat, the better, and particularly vegetables. Grains are good, but vegetables even better. All right, that's a long-winded answer. I'm not vegan, but I appreciate vegan cuisine. My friends, sending you big love from the West Coast. May you have a really sweet and happy Purim, and I hope you'll tune in tomorrow at noon Pacific when I will be reading the book of Esther with vim and vigor and elan and style here, and maybe even a little bit of commentary. And we'll have the donate button on, and all donations tomorrow during the book of Esther reading, the Megillah reading, will go directly to the needy, to people suffering, hunger and other kinds of deprivation. It'll go to the poor, right? All donations tomorrow will go directly to the poor. All right, my friends, take good care. All the best.